Well, thank you very much, Priscilla. So, folks, I hope you're ready for this. So, I'm going to try to do a mix here. I'm going to get those guys to talk a little bit about themselves in relationship to diversity and inclusion and how this actually helps us improve our services to the public. And then at one point, we'll turn to you, and it's going to be time for you to stop being quiet and ask some tough questions so that it can actually trigger some useful thoughts for all of us, okay? So I'm going to try to get them started. We got the introduction, so I'm not going to do anything that looks like a round table, and I'm just going to start shooting. So let's see how we do. First question, folks. As you know, everything we do in the BC Public Service, or for that matter, any public service, is actually aimed ultimately at serving the public, right? In our case, British Columbians. And we are lucky, I would actually argue, that British Columbia has a very, very diverse population, and in all sort of ways, right? Regionally diverse, ethnically diverse, all sort of ways, we are quite a diverse population. So I'd like you to tell me if you can remember a time when you had to face that diversity as a public servant and actually feel that you had to adapt to effectively serve the public, right? Because you were looking at a crowd or looking at a segment of the population that was so diverse and possibly different from you that you had to actually change your game a little bit to feel that you were being effective. So for this question, I'm going to ask, let me see. Cheryl, how about you start us up on this?
Thanks, okay. Sure. That seemed hopeful. Okay, I'll try that. Thanks, Okenge, and thanks everybody for being here. And it's an honor to be here and have an opportunity to speak to you today about diversity and inclusion. And I've been in ADM for about 2 years, and I think that I work at MCFD, and so it's just a bit of a context there for the child welfare system is that we do a lot of work with Indigenous people. And that I'm going to assume people have some basics that Indigenous people, are struggling under the impacts of colonialism, and that one of the areas that shows up in is with children and families. And so when I started with MCFD, I hadn't done a lot of work with Indigenous people, and so I was on quite a learning curve. So I think when I think about a time where I had to do some learning and figure things out and adjust my approach, it was in my work with Indigenous people. And there's different things you can do to do that, right? You want to learn the history. So I did that, and there's courses I can take, and I've done that. But one of the other things with the child welfare system is that as a representative of the public service, sometimes what you're on the end of is some very well-founded and justified anger at the system. And that, for me, I think was one of the biggest things to figure out. So you can learn in your head about Indigenous people and the history. You can understand some sort of the cultural differences around how people maybe introduce themselves, the importance of relationship, the connection between head and heart. But you still got to, for me, you still have to figure out for yourself, how do you manage that? Because I'm white, as white gets. We're a grudge-holding kind of family of seethers. Displays of...
I told you it was going to be personal.
Yeah, okay. So expressions of anger are outside sort of my comfort zone, or they kind of mean danger. So what does it mean then if someone's expressing anger, which I get is well justified? And so I had to figure that out, what to do with that myself. And I think the key thing for me is really understanding that people's anger at the system which I'm representing is my education. Like, that is part of my education. And to me, wrapping my head and heart around that concept allowed me to open my sort of ears and my heart to hearing that anguish sometimes that people are experiencing because of that over-involvement of the child welfare system in their lives, in their families' lives, in their communities. So for me, I'll say that was the key point, is that if that's something you're facing, is that anger is part of your education. So you got to hear that.
No, thank you for that. There was a lot there, so thanks for that. Sunny, you want to tell us a little bit about a time you felt that way?
Yeah, thanks, Okange. For context of the audience, I'm currently the ADM for Real Property Division. So in this division, we manage the office space and stewardship of the real estate on behalf of the province. So in my current role, me or my staff do not directly provide service to the citizens, but we provide a lot of service to the clients like you, who provide service to the citizens. So to answer your question, one thing that comes to my mind is something indirectly that we had to do to support our citizens better. So as part of a process that we initiated to improve our frontline service counters to citizens, we realized that many of our frontline service counters, like Service BC counters, counters of the Ministry of Social Development, Poverty Reduction, MCFD, when I visited those offices, I saw many of those offices were not really designed to serve a lot of our clients with disabilities. For example, many of our offices were accessible up to a minimum code that is required in BC or the local municipality codes. Say, for example, an office would have accessible to wheelchair, but when any citizen in a wheelchair were to come and access those services, the counters were this high and there's no way those citizens could access those services. So we have started a gradual process of initiating a project to have height adjustable tables in each of those centers, so that when anybody is in a wheelchair who's not able to rise comes to those services, we are able to provide them services the way it suits them. In addition, as part of this project, when we got input from a lot of our employees with disabilities, we also got inputs that many of our employees are not comfortable in using a washroom which is either labeled male or female. So we're also working in conjunction with Public Service Agency to have more inclusive washrooms, especially in places where we provide frontline services to the clients. Similarly, for accessibility, as I mentioned earlier, we are required to provide offices which meet the minimal accessible codes, but at the same time, that does not help many of our citizens. The code says that you must have one door to a building from the parking lot which is accessible, but that's not enough. So we have recently partnered with the Rick Hansen Foundation to go and visit many of our frontline offices and to provide us valuable inputs how we can provide our services. And gradually we are making differences which I think will help create a more inclusive environment for our citizens.
That's such an interesting set of examples, right? Because it almost, once you fix the problem, well, that was common sense, right? People can't actually access the counter, but until you actually you start focusing on it, you're just not thinking about it when you're a fully able person. Deb, what about you? You want to tell us about an instance?
Maybe. Down for a second. Push it down for a while. Is that better? There we go. Hi, everyone. I'm Deb Godfrey. I am the ADM for People and Organizational Development at the agency and have the utmost pleasure of working with Priscilla and her team under my portfolio. So to say that I learn every day on this file is an understatement. I was thinking about diversity and inclusion and thinking about I came from the Ministry of Health where I grew up. I spent a lot of time there and a number of years. And thinking about what were the changes that we made in policy development and support that to allow us to be more diverse and inclusive. And I didn't realize at the time that our patient-centered approach was actually focused on exactly that. How were we building policy around services that were being delivered to ensure that it was meeting the need of the patient? And in order to do that, you really needed to include the patient in the decision, understand, where they live, what their their culture, how you get services, what services were accessible, all of those types of things. And so we made a shift a number of years ago to take that patient-centered approach, and that brought actually diversity to the table. It brought, and not to say it's perfect, but it was the starting point, I think, in including patients as partners to understand really what the needs were of the British Columbians that we were serving. And so that for me was, when I look back, was really the focus on a beginning of becoming more diverse and inclusive. How do you get, like I said, how do you meet the needs of metro, urban, rural, remote? How do you ensure that you have, that those services are getting to those people that need it, and how do you do it in a culturally safe way? So I think that would be the piece that I reflect back on and think, while I wasn't aware really, or wasn't front of mind that was intentionally more inclusive and diverse approach, I can look back now and say, oh, that actually was a big contributing factor. The other piece that we did there was included patients as partners as part of our governance, at our governance tables. So we get a different perspective there on the impact that those decisions that we were making from a policy perspective were having on the population that we were serving. I think that was one of the pieces that I look back and reflect on and think, that was just a really strong start in that approach.
Well, thank you for that, Deb.
Thank you.
Jeff, does your mic work?
Hello.
There you go.
So, good morning, everybody. So I have been an ADM for almost a decade. My background is architecture and collaborative problem solving. And I guess just by the way I was trained, inviting people to the table to talk about what they might need is actually just something that's in my DNA. And so I like Deb's example. I have a lot of examples in my career where you do exactly that. And I never thought about it this way as well, Deb, until asked this question, because I thought, well, I guess I've been kind of outsourcing diversity in this sense, because the public service is actually diverse to a point, but it may not be actually diverse in the way we actually need at a point in time. And so, for example, most recently, we have now a tuition waiver program for Form Youth in Care. And unless we have a lot of self-identified Form Youth in Care in the province, which working for government, which I don't know of a group like that, it's like, well, how do we actually create policy that's not going to impact people negatively? And I've never been a fan of what's, ivory tower policy development. I like to kind of get out there and have focus groups and conversations. And so we did exactly that. We actually worked with institutions, the post-secondary institutions, in terms of students that were self-identified. We worked with the advocate for RCY. Sorry, my brain. Thank you, the representative for youth. And we actually pulled together a focus group to help us sort of troubleshoot policy, figure out what they needed, and figure out what impacts are. And actually, the silver lining out of all of that, I'm a little bit opportunistic when I actually meet with folks that way, because I always actually sing the praises of public policy idea building. And it's like, if you like this conversation, come on, work with us. And we actually, through these processes over the years, I actually have been able to increase diversity in the public service by exposing folks to conversations and actually inviting them into the dialogue as permanent employees. I myself, I love public policy. I didn't even know what public policy was till I was 35, because I had not any exposure to what that term was. My poor kids, who are now adults, actually knew about that since they were 3 years old, and they both love it. But as I said, It's interesting being part of a dialogue to build ideas, and building ideas typically means taking apart old ideas, and that means, I think, in today's environment, inviting people to the table who actually are going to be impacted by those ideas to build a new one more effectively. And that may sound a bit abstract, but that's kind of what I do.
Well, actually, it's not abstract at all, and it's a perfect segue into my next question, because what you seem to suggest is that, in a way, your educational background and your first career, so to speak, prepared you for sort of involving the client or the user of whatever service or design you were working on. And so my question to Deb now, before I move to others, did you feel well prepared when you encounter like the experience you talked about with others? Like, did you feel like the organization was supportive? You were well prepared to actually adapt to that quote unquote challenge you faced?
Am I working? Okay. Two questions there, right? Did I feel the organization supported, and did I feel prepared? Those are two different questions. I actually felt, given the direction that the organization had set, that I felt supported by the organization in going a certain direction, which is, to me, is a little bit different than feeling prepared for going into some spaces where you have to be vulnerable and you have to lead with humility and know that you don't know and you may not master. So I think that I felt prepared because the organization had set a direction and a commitment on where we're going, and as prepared as I could be in whatever circumstance that I was going into, I would say. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So Sunny, when you guys encounter those very concrete and real issues, I mean, it doesn't get more real than that. It's real estate. It's basically the physical environment in which we work. Any resistance in the system? Like, was everybody went, oh my goodness, how could we not have thought about that? Or can you tell us a little bit more about that aspect of things?
Yeah. Thanks. I would say it's a bit of a yes and no answer. So when were we prepared? Was the organization supportive? The organization was very supportive, but at the same time, what the questions we had was that why did we not think about this earlier? And some of these are very basic common sense issues, but why did we not think about that? At the same time, I also felt that sometimes when the disabilities are not visible, unless we have a formal program like what we have now, we don't even think of some of the challenges that our employees, our clients, our citizens would be facing. For example, we may invite 10 people for a conference call, and we may not even know that one of the employees may be having some disability as related to hearing. We may invite a new employee for an interview and not realizing that the interview room may not have a wheelchair access. We may be designing a new courthouse and not realizing that the witness box is not accessible by wheelchairs. So these are the things that we did not have answers to, readily available answers, and we are still grappling with some of those answers. But it's a good process. We've started the process, so I think we're on the right path, but we were still grappling with a lot of those questions. The organization support is there in principle, but we also know that if we really have to make our workplaces truly inclusive, it needs huge investments. For example, our division is responsible for managing 1,800 buildings in the province, owned, leased, and managed buildings. Now you imagine that each of those buildings could be having 10 washrooms, and in case we need to create accessible, inclusive washrooms, what is the kind of investment required? So support is there, but I think it's a bit of a process when we'll get there.
No, thanks for that. Now, Cheryl, I'm afraid to ask you the same question, given what you said about your family background, just in terms of feeling prepared. But when you went through all of this, did you end up feeling that you were effective in your interaction with, a set of a segment of the BC population that maybe you were not accustomed to and you didn't know as well as the rest of the population? Did you feel that after all the effort you made and the measures you took, you felt effective in that interaction?
I like to think I was effective, but I think you have to be on the right learning curve, right? It shouldn't be overwhelmingly steep, but it probably is a little bit uncomfortable at times. And so notice that and what's making you uncomfortable and figure it out. And I think there is really good organizational supports at MCFD. For me, there has been, because MCFD is pretty unified in its understanding of the need to really partner with Indigenous people in terms of fixing the system, fixing the services so that they work better for them. So for me, it's been about developing those relationships so that I can be effective, so that I can bring that information, bring those voices to the table as we look to make changes to the system.
So we've talked about the people we serve and how diverse they are and some of their needs, and then sort of our own sort of personal path to discovery sometimes as we interact with them. Priscilla actually mentioned that we met with interns from the Workable program, the Indigenous interns, and I was actually probably more struck than she was by the energy and the ideas, and I really felt privileged to welcome those guys into the public service. So my question to you now is trying to get your views about, in your opinion, how does a more diverse and inclusive BC public service, like internally, how does that actually help us improve our ability to basically better serve British Columbians? Like when we look internally at the composition of our workforce, have you witnessed anything? Have you experienced things where you can say, yeah, no, I saw that, and I see how this is making us better? Jeff, you want to start us on that?
Sure. So actually, I'll start with Indigenous interns as an example, and also co-op students. Working in the Ministry of Advanced Education and Skills and Training, we enjoy having both co-op students and as well. I'm very privileged in my job. I get to go to all the 25 public post-secondary institutions and meet with young people all the time, all year round. And I am truly inspired at what the future holds, because they're amazing young minds who are passionate and also fearless talking about things that traditionally we have held ourselves back from talking about. And so I enjoy having co-op students and interns who, I mean, used an example earlier, or somebody did, I think Priscilla, maybe about interns asking tough questions to ministers. It's like, I love having this sort of fearless presence of inquiring minds asking tough questions and getting great benefit from it. Also, just again, being careful. I don't want to put pressure on Indigenous interns to carry the weight of our learning. But when they're interested to actually help out, very, very grateful. So one example, our ministry is doing much more, as Cheryl said, we're doing much more work in community. It's new for our ministry to be going in community and working with chiefs and hereditary chiefs. And I had a meeting scheduled that I thought was a phone meeting, and it wasn't. Actually, a hereditary chief came to visit the building. And the building I work in is St. Anne's. And if you know St. Anne's in Victoria, it looks like a residential school. It's actually that historical kind of building. And so this chief showed up and spent the first 20 minutes in the meeting obviously quite taken aback about the building he was in and the nature of the meeting and meeting with government this way. And I just said to folks, okay, time, like we can't do this again. We can't repeat this kind of interaction. Our Indigenous intern stepped up and said, you know what, I have lots of ideas about how protocol-wise we could handle this differently. And she basically spent a week talking with elders and pulling together for us a bit of a roadmap of how we could actually invite people into our building or find other locations to actually support productive meetings. And so incredible value added for somebody stepping up and really wanting to make our experiences better. So.
No, thanks. That's a great example, and thank you for mentioning that. It's a very important point. They cannot carry the weight of our learning for us, right? So it is really something that is to be done in in a very sort of sensible way, and making sure we are aware of what people can actually, willing to participate in. Absolutely. Deb, any examples you want to share?
Are we working here? I think that for a long time, we've known, as we've read through leadership literature, that a strengths-based approach and having different strengths at the table bring you the best value. And I think this is taking that even a step further to say that the more diversity you bring to the table, the better you understand the greater outcomes that you get. And so I do think that that's the value in having the different perspectives, different experience, different education, different lived experience that brings that strength to the table for making better decisions and ultimately having better outcomes for our citizens.
Sunny?
Yeah, thanks, Kinge. The question we're trying to answer is that how does a diverse and more inclusive workforce really strengthen our service and help us better serve British Columbians? So I've got 3-4 examples. Quickly, I'll give you, and then I'll get to the meat of the answer. As part of this committee, one thing we started doing was at each of our committees, we would invite people with different challenges or a diverse group of people to give us inputs about what work needs to be done. And at one of the committees, we had somebody from the Indigenous Youth Intern Program. And so when we started talking to him, he mentioned about his life history. He had grown up on the street. He had been part of gang violence. He had been to a correction center. He had no formal education. And now he currently works with the Ministry of Children and Family Development. I'll talk about the context later. I have my own personal experience when I came to Canada from India in 2010, and I was in the military for 20 years. And in those 20 years, I had never even given an interview, so I had no clue how to even have a right resume or how to write a cover letter. And here I came to BC, I started applying for jobs, and I wouldn't even get a job interview because I was not skilled even to, maybe I had not learned the ropes how to manage the system. In one of my previous positions before coming here, I used to work with the BC Emergency Health Services, and when we would send ambulances to, say, a diverse place like Surrey, many times we would encounter trying to help an elder, say maybe from a South Asian community, who would not understand English. And if both the paramedics are not able to understand the local language, they'll find very hard to communicate with those people. So the reason I'm giving these examples is that when we have a diverse set of employees who join our service, you can imagine how enriched the service would be. In the first example that I gave about that Indigenous youth, it really challenged our belief that are our hiring practices correct? We always insist on having, say, a formal post-secondary education, a degree, but when we interacted with that individual and what great service he was providing, it really challenged all our beliefs on the committee that we really need to think differently how we hire. How much importance do we really give to lived experiences? And most of you would have been involved in some hiring processes, and we currently see that we do not give enough importance to lived experiences. So that really changed our belief, and we are in the process of changing some of the hiring processes. Similarly, when I look at my own experience, when I look at resumes now or people who apply for jobs, I look at things beyond that. Maybe a person is from a different culture, maybe a different country. So we need to look at things that appear beyond the cover letters and beyond the resumes. And I know that public service agencies are also looking at the hiring practices and what we can do different to attract talent, which may not be readily accessible through our normal traditional processes. The third example I gave about BC Emergency Health Services, again, when you have employees with diverse language, cultural abilities, it just enriches the service. It makes us more richer. It challenges our beliefs and the status quo. So there are a lot of advantages like these which I think are enriched by a diverse and inclusive workforce.
Well, thank you. Cheryl.
So if you think you were worried about asking me the previous question, you're going to like this one. Let's talk about using the washrooms. Okay. So MCFD recently, not that recently, is in a building, and we moved into this building, and the doors are super heavy, and they don't have electric openers, or they didn't when we first moved in. So people who had mobility issues had a very difficult time moving around the building, and difficult time then accessing washroom facilities. So that's one thing. On my way here yesterday, I came from Victoria. Between leaving Victoria and coming to, let's say, getting to my hotel room, I think I talked to maybe 4 people. And out of those 4 people, 2 of them I had to have discussions. Well, they initiated discussions about my gender with them. I wasn't really interested in having that discussion with them, but nonetheless, it happened. So for me, so I walk in here this morning, and this is consistent now with PSA-sponsored events and my workplace. There is a washroom that is gender neutral. So I don't have to have a gender conversation when I just really need to pee. So, because nobody really wants to do that when you just got to pee. So these things are important. And also the other point is if that's not on your radar, we've got blind spots, right? If that's not a thing you have to contend with, then you just don't see it. And to me, that's the reason we need to think about making, if you have employees in your organization who don't feel like they can access a washroom safely, they're probably, I guess, a ridiculous stress to have at work, not being able to bring their best to the work environment, right? So we need to have those folks feel safe. We need to understand that we have blind spots. So as much as I can think I understand the impacts of, a policy or a program or a service or whatever it is, you've got to bring that diversity and just accept the fact that we have blind spots. And the more we can have employees recruited who can help fill those blind spots, the better we'll do with citizens. And I think that's been mentioned a few times today, right, by Jeff and Sunny talked about, until you think about it, you just don't think about it. And so just acknowledging that we have those blind spots and that it makes a huge difference to people when we start to see them and make sure the workplace is safe, and then our services to citizens also become better and more well-informed.
No, thanks for that. Now, this is a perfect segue in one of the sessions you guys are going to have later on GBA Plus. If you guys, I'm sorry I'm singling out one session, but, in terms of blind spot and thinking about, designing policy that actually works for everybody, that's a session that you'll find quite interesting. The others are fantastic as well, but I just want to point that out. Jeff? Yes.
So I want to add to what Cheryl's saying. Cheryl and I have worked together for many, many years in various ministries. And Cheryl does this amazing thing when confronted with a blind spot. And she actually takes the moment of like I didn't know that, or that's, what do I do with that information? She just says, that's fascinating. And by saying that's fascinating, what she does quite cleverly is she creates some space, and she takes the moment of maybe uncertainty or fear or anxiety, and she turns it into a moment of actually curiosity or inquiry, just by saying, that's fascinating. And I've seen her do it dozens of times, where staff might come lighting their hair on fire over any number of things, and she just says, that's fascinating. And then basically within that phrase changes the whole dialogue to a place like, let's talk about it. Let's figure it out. So I just wanted to acknowledge that in terms of blind spots, my colleague's strength in actually doing something about it, and how she does it.
So we only allocated 60 minutes for this, and I know I have passed the midpoint, so I don't want to shortchange the audience. I'm sure that there are questions, because I have one more I could ask, but I'd like to turn to the audience here and see if there are any burning questions you would like to ask the panel. I see one hand over there. I see a second hand. So if we have microphones in the room, do we have microphones? Yes, we do. And thank you for identifying yourselves, if you don't mind, and your ministry. Thank you.
I most certainly will. I'm Cheryl Grice, and I'm from MCFD. Cheryl, hi. I'm the identifiable person that had a problem going to the bathroom in my new building at MCFD when it opened. Sunny, Jeff, I had the opportunity to speak with you guys at the Executive Council on Diversity and Inclusion. I'm curious because I look around the room and I see a lot of representation from multicultural backgrounds as well as different LGBTQ Two-Spirit Plus identifiers, as well as our Indigenous coworkers, and obviously a big area that we have to address. However, I also look around and I know that I'm the only one that's using mobility devices, and sorry, I didn't think I was going to get emotional, but the fact of the matter is that the BC Public Service is still not a safe place for people that do identify as having disabilities. I also think that because of that, we are missing a big opportunity in terms of policy and innovation. I think that we do have a lot of blind spots in terms of our service and systems when we describe things like extra service and special needs and all of these different words that I take offense to as a person who identifies. I was wondering if the panel could respond to how we can make diversity inclusive as a general path forward, rather than identifying spots or marginalized groups individually and working with that one area. Because I will say that I've seen the way that this organization can change on a dime to address the needs of our Indigenous partners, which I should have happened. But I do think that I've heard from colleagues and even executive above me, it's not your turn, Shara. It's not your turn. And when we have that happening in the public service, that we're prioritizing your marginalization, I'm wondering how we can get to a place where real public policy can affect the change that we want for our vulnerable British Columbians.
So first of all, I want to thank you for your courage and for your honesty. This is really, really helpful. Thank you for the question. And before turning to the panel, I want to tell you about a story. So I was meeting, with a group of people who were talking about disabilities, and there was a federal representative there. I think she's deputy minister responsible for disability issues in the workplace in Ottawa. And she said something that was striking and really stuck with me. She said, when we're among ourselves, we call you guys the temporary able people. Because if you live long enough, all of us end up having some kind of physical disability, anyways. And I, just that phrase stopped me in my tracks and got me thinking a little bit. And that speaks to your point about spatial needs and extra service and extra accommodation. In a way, you're right. It's just, if you start thinking about somebody who can run, jump, and walk normally as a temporary able person, that changes your outlook on things quite a bit. Turning to my panel now, any reactions to the comment and questions from my colleague, Jeff?
So I'll start, and I want to thank you for the courage, but also what you just did in this room is actually part of how we actually get there. It's really personal stories, and as Cheryl said, it's blind spots. And the way you actually take care of blind spots is by whatever way you can, helping reveal them. I came into government 25 years ago. I was the provincial accessibility advisor, and I used my architectural and design background. I spent the first 5 years on advocacy internally to government, helping make the built environment more accessible. And what you're saying has not changed much since then, in the sense that I'm going to use the word, it was a kind of a ghettoized file. So I was a specialist brought in, I had 5 years, I was kind of a standalone. And as Okenge says, I actually was called quite lovingly lovingly by all the people I worked with. I worked with the Office of Disability Issues. I was referred to as the token able-bodied guy because I was the only guy, and with a lot of love, right? And so, but the thing is, it's exposure. So I had so much exposure to amazing hearts and amazing minds who just happened to be wheelchair users, and by that exposure, it became my normal. And I think, just as you're saying, so yes, there can be big province-wide policies and kind of initiatives. There's also just the day-to-day interaction where people, I think, I like Cheryl's language, we need to actually all take a good look at our own blind spots and some of the things that get in the way of us, heart to heart, meeting people to people, to actually improve the diversity of the workforce. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Jeff. Sunny?
Yeah, again, thanks for the question. I'd just like to share a few things. One is, as part of this committee where we discuss, I'd like to share with you that we absolutely acknowledge that diversity in itself does not create inclusion. We absolutely acknowledge that, and we understand that an inclusive environment must be intentionally designed and nurtured and created. And a lot of things that are being discussed and planned at this stage is to make sure that we formally address inclusion. That's one. Second is, again, we acknowledge that as a service, we have a lot of blind spots, and a lot of them just come by a lack of awareness, lack of knowledge. And you mentioned the term special needs. I came from a culture where this term was very often used and was supposed to be respectful. But coming here and having done more research, when we created this document, Words Matter, we made it quite clear there that using a word like special needs may be offensive to many. And again, when somebody is using that term, it may not be intentional. But what I'm trying to say is gradually we'll get there where we'll make ourselves and our teams and our employees more aware about what are the right words to use. We also acknowledge that for many of us, it may not seem still like a safe place. But again, we have, I think, started on the right path. The recent survey that we discussed yesterday, is going to be made available to all of you, I think, in the next few weeks. We were quite pretty unhappy about the percentage of employees who feel unsafe and who've seen behavior which is not appropriate. So what I'm saying is that I know we have a long way to go, but there are a number of things in the pipeline and currently happening which will make sure that we get better as a service, we create an environment which is more inclusive and support more diversity.
Thank you. Cheryl?
Yeah, so thank you for that. And I also thank you for your tireless advocacy on this issue. Quite a bit's been said already by the panel, so I won't repeat that, but I just want to note one caution in there, and I think this is something that there's an easy invitation into doing this, which is to have a sort of a competition around levels of marginalization, or sort of look at that there's a limited amount of resources and that there's a competition for those resources, and that competition is focused on who's the most marginalized. And I think you have a caution in there for us, and I just want to acknowledge that and think that we as executive need to hear that. And I'm not just sure, I'm a slow processor, so I'm not always that great on panels, but I need some time to process that. But I hear what you're saying there, and I think that's a really excellent caution, and something we need to take into consideration. So thank you.
I'm sure I saw a couple of hands. Yes, we have one hand in the same corner, and then we have one here in the front.
Yeah, just my name is Harry Gill. I'm from the Ministry of Forest, Lands, and Natural Resource Operations, and my question is about two words: demographics and digital transformation. The way we're leading, are we truly serving the demographics of the BC population?
So my short answer to that is I definitely hope we are. If not, it would be quite a massive fail. But I guess we could dig a little bit into that. And I guess the first point to make before I let the panel answer is that the face of BC is changing over time. Right? If you look at the demographics and you look at the different generation, and now baby boomers are retiring and some are actually passing away, and our generation X, is sorry, just it's like a circle of life. A millennial coming in, and that has an impact not only out in our streets but also in our workforce, and that change is something that's real, and it's something that we need to adapt to. Do we adapt fast enough? That's a good question. And when you add a technology to that, then you probably compounding our challenges. But Jeff, how about you start us on this?
So that's a great question, and it is a moving target. And so the question is, to me, the question becomes, what is our role in keeping our finger in the pulse of a moving target? And so I can tell you that in the Ministry of Advanced Education, we do know that there are going to be significant demographic shifts in the next decade. There's going to be actually less 20 to 25-year-olds, which is actually by quite a significant percentage. And so what that means is we're actually doing forward-thinking work to figure out what the future framing of the public post-secondary system. So we actually shift more to upskilling and mid-career learners, because that's actually what the province is going to need. But it is a moving target. And I want to also just be a little bit philosophical. I'm a painter. And I had a painting teacher years ago who talked about not getting too fixated on the outcome, but actually acknowledging that every painting is a series of adjustments. And that's how I look at this work, to be honest. You put down a mark, you actually take a look at how that's influenced the marks that are already down there, you stand back, assess it, you put down another mark, and it's a series of adjustments to get you to a place where it's serving its purpose. And that may not be an accurate enough a comment, but we don't, it's not a precise art to actually reflect the population. And so we do our best to constantly make a series of adjustments in terms of the programs we're delivering, in my ministry anyway.
So I hope you're not going to go as far as cutting one of your ears or anything like that to emulate one of your...
If I did, that would be my artistic expression, and that's...
Sorry, that was a failed attempt, a reference to Van Gogh, but let's move on quickly. Deb?
So I think does that work? Yeah. I think the other piece is that we are looking at the future of work. We're looking at our demographics. The Deputy Minister's Council on Public Service Renewal is looking at all of that data, and which will feed into our overall corporate plan. And will we get there fast enough? Maybe not, but it is certainly front and center at the tables that are making those decisions and setting the future direction. So I just wanted to assure you that is being looked at.
Any other contributions to that? Sunny?
Thanks, Okenge. Yeah, and thanks for the question. Again, at a philosophical level, one thing I've realized moving into this position is that as public servants, I think these days we are confronted with a much bigger and complex problems than we can solve. What I'm trying to say is that we, overall, if we have to serve British Columbians very well on a day-to-day basis, we have much more challenging, complex problems, and it's sometimes difficult to stay ahead of the curve. So this is one of those problems that whether we have done enough to serve the different demographics, to some extent, yes, more can be done, but the intent is there, but have we done fast enough? I'm not sure, because there are so many other more complex problems. I know that from my previous work with health, there are a number of things being done by the Ministry of Health and by health authorities that are addressing a lot of things, for example, to help support seniors in their own communities. A lot of policies by health authorities, how again seniors would take priority in a lot of the way care is provided. but certainly more can be done. As part of this survey that I referred to earlier, we also found out that within our employee group, employees who are, I think, under 30 or who are baby boomers don't feel as inclusive as other employees. So again, there are a few things that we need to do there to make sure that all diverse set of population in different age groups are supported more. I'm sure there'll be some action items coming out of that. And I'm hopeful that the intent is right, we are on the right path, but of course, for many of these complex challenges, more can be done.
Thank you. I'm sure we have time for a couple more questions. We had one or two in the front here.
No?
Yep.
Can you hear me? Hi. My name is Tammy Davies. I work for the Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction. I'm going to give you a little bit of my story just to give context to my question. I have what people would refer to as an invisible disability, and I struggled with it in my work. It took 2.5 years to get an accommodation for my disability. In the course of my experience, other people came forward to me in confidence to tell me about their own experiences. One person ended up in hospital on suicide watch because of her experience trying to be treated with fairness, respect, dignity with her invisible disability. We had a new hire who came in to our office, shaky, who was a person who has a disability, who uses a wheelchair, who none of our doors opened for this person. They were going to modify the doors, they were going to modify the lunchroom doors, the bathroom doors, everything for this person, but it was an extremely slow process. I later heard that the same leadership that had caused a great deal of suffering for myself and the other colleagues who shared with me their experiences had not really made it a welcoming or safe space for her as far as her disability. So she ended up leaving this person, and she was great. I would love to have seen her stay. I work in a contact center for the Ministry of Social Development, so we're working with people with disabilities all day long. We're talking to people, diverse British Columbians of all different gender, background, I'm having trouble speaking, sorry. All different cultural backgrounds, all different, from everywhere, everybody, basically. So for clients to have somebody who has disabilities working with them, who understands what it's like from their perspective, I think is like you were speaking earlier, Sunny, about how it adds a better service to our clients, to our citizens. I think it's very important. My experience has been, so now getting to the question. My experience has been that from the directors upward, there's great enlightenment. There's knowledge, understanding, compassion, thoughtfulness, progressiveness, action. From the manager level down in our leadership, I have found that if you don't fit into the box, if you're not doing the job exactly the same as everybody else, if you can't do it exactly the same as everybody else, you don't fit, and you shouldn't be there. And I have heard that they have said things like, well, you signed a contract for a job. If you can't do the job, you should look somewhere else. This is not a welcoming environment. It's not a safe environment. If a person is on suicide watch and other people have dropped and left and quit because of the abuse and the bullying that goes on for people who don't necessarily fit into the box, it's not great for people with disabilities working for public service. My question is, what are we doing on a practical scale to educate these managers and these supervisors and encouraging them to behave in a way that includes everyone, not just people who fit into their conception of fitting into the box of how the job should be done. What are we doing to enlighten their blind spots, to remove their blind spots, to say that's fascinating? How can we do this differently? How can we include everyone so that when you come to work, you don't constantly feel like you're being watched, that you're not living up to their ideal of what it is to do the job? And I'm very good at my job. My work was never in question. I was told that my work is excellent. That's my question.
Well, listen, again, I have to start by thanking you for your courage. It's amazing that you guys feel that you can share those personal stories with us. On behalf of the panel, I think that the one answer I can give, because I work at the PSA, is that we are quite live to that, and the specific issue of invisible disabilities, for lack of a better term, and we basically trying to enhance managers' training. So one of our ADM who's not here today, Joanne Hansen, is actually working quite hard, and she launched a manager certification pilot program to try and basically make all of us better and stronger at that job, which is supervising others and creating this work environment that is more inclusive and welcoming. It is it's quite the endeavor, right? Because it's one thing to provide an excellent course, but then there's the day after the end of the course and implementing this and monitoring it, etc. So quite live to that issue. My hope is that those kind of situation can be surfaced early enough that action can be taken, because I would never be able to fully understand what you went through, but I suppose that the longer this frustration and this lack of understanding lasts, the worse it is for you. So my hope is that even before we fix the environment, we can at least provide an environment where people can speak up quicker so that we can take action quicker. Panel members, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I'd like to add to that, and thank you for sharing your story. Through the Learning Center, we have a number of pieces around respectful workplace, around managing the BC Public Service, supervising the BC Public Service, all of those pieces that come together to help to equip managers and teams. We have conflict management supports as well that could help that. And I think the other piece is, we have standards of conduct and the way that we all behave as and are expected to behave as public servants and take an oath to behave. It's a tricky piece, because it's the ability to escalate and then to have something done about it, to potentially have your leader, manager, supervisor learn and grow and develop, and or not, and something happens there. So I think that the starting point of surfacing and being brave and bringing forward your issues is great, and I wouldn't necessarily stop there. And how do we get some supports for you and the team and all supervisors and managers, because it could very well be that it's through blind spots or a lack of awareness. That's one of the pieces that we're focusing on too, is how do we get further awareness, increased education, and then the expectation that you're taking that and doing something with it. So thank you again.
Sunny?
Yeah, again, thanks for the question. I think these questions are very difficult questions, so we absolutely appreciate you raising these and making the issue very real. So just 2-3 things I would like to mention. One is, what I personally think is that by this action plan, one of the best thing that is happening is that we are normalizing these conversations. Just by making sure that you are able to openly and safely be able to talk about these things is going to make a cultural change. I think with your story, everybody in this room does acknowledge that there's a real problem that we need to do something about it, and I'm sure everybody is committed to be doing that. And Deb spoke about a few practical things that will be happening, and you'll also see that down the road there'll be what we're calling it a diversity and inclusive essentials training. So that training will be basically meant for all the public service employees, and gradually as we become more aware, I'll see a cultural change. I'll give you another personal example. In my division, in real estate, how we improve buildings, there's some kind of archaic decision-making principles. And what those principles say is that if work is requested by a ministry, the ministry pays for it. And if the work is requested by my division, I pay for it. And in one of the ministries, a new employee was hired who was in a wheelchair, and they requested automatic door openers. And at the lower level, there was, I think, fight going on for months who's going to pay for that. And when it came to my attention, we immediately addressed this issue. But what I'm trying to change at my level, and all of us are trying to do, is just that cultural change. That we need to be more sensitive to these requests. We need to look at these things beyond just some decision-making principles. So I'm sure with this work that is being done through this action plan, gradually we'll get to a culture which is much more inclusive. I know there's a long way to go, but with more awareness, more training, talking about these things, I'm sure that with time we'll become a much more inclusive and a sensitive organization.
What I was afraid of is happening. We're running out of time. I knew this was going to be something that would be great interest to everybody. Here's what I'm proposing. Some of the questions, there were probably a couple of hands that we were not able to address. First of all, I'll make myself available, so I'll be happy to have a chat with a couple of people who raised their hands and we couldn't get to. But we're going to have breakout sessions on topics that are related, although slightly different from what we just discussed. So if your questions are relevant to the breakout sessions you're going to be attending, please feel free to ask those questions there. I'd like to take this opportunity now to thank our panelists again. Jeff, Cheryl, Deb, Sunny, thank you so much for participating in this and for sharing your experience with the audience. Thanks.